and welcome to the session for Capri members on environmental product declarations. My name is Richard Willis, and I'm the Vice President for Engineering Research and Technology with the National Asphalt Pavement Association, and I also serve as the Chair of the Executive Committee for Capri. Over the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes, my colleague and I, Joseph Shackett, who's our Director of Sustainable Pavements in NAPA, are going to try to give you a pretty high level view of the current state of where environmental product declarations are, why as a contractor or a DOT you should be aware of them, and kind of what we're seeing from a federal standpoint in terms of policy and legislation, and then also give you a little bit of information in terms of where they're going. And so not sure how questions will be handled, but if you have some, you can put them in the chat box. We'll move through the presentation and then I guess try to handle those at the end. But we appreciate your being here, and we'll look forward to talking with you a little bit about this portion of our business, which is changing rapidly. It seems like almost every day. With that, I'll turn it over to Joseph to start the presentation today.
Great. Thank you, Richard. And first of all, thanks for having me here to present. I know Richard's going to be presenting kind of with me at the tail end of this session. I'm looking forward to this. It's a topic that I've been really focused on pretty heavily for the last couple of years, and it's a primary kind of aspect of what I'm doing here at NAPA. So let me share my, I've got screen sharing disabled, so I'm wondering whoever the host is, if you can enable screen sharing, at least for me. Oh, here we go. Thank you. Okay, so that was just a minor hiccup, and we're going to get started. And please, I guess if you have questions, you can throw them into the chat, and we'll try to address all the questions at the end. But we'll just kind of go through the slide deck here. So as Richard said, broad overview of what EPDs are, kind of what's going on with buy clean policies, and how all this kind of plays together for the industry and for asphalt pavements in general. Okay, so I always love to start at the beginning, which is what are EPDs, to make sure we all know what they are. But before we even do that, I want to start with what is this term embodied carbon that you've probably heard about, and I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. We're talking about the carbon emissions, the CO2 emissions associated with manufacturing, transporting, and installing construction materials. So this is all the upstream emissions associated with raw material extraction and processing, moving materials around from place to place, in our case, asphalt plant operations. And embodied carbon as a general term includes things like paving activities and then future maintenance of the activity, all those embodied future maintenance of the pavement, all the embodied emissions associated with those activities and materials. It's different from the operational carbon, and this image is really looking at the building example, which would be your building energy consumption, things like your heating, ventilation, air conditioning system, and your lighting and that sort of thing. But extending that to the world of pavements, operational carbon could be things like, the lighting for your roadway, if you have lighting or traffic lights and that sort of thing, if you're looking at from a whole roadway perspective. And the biggest kind of potential input there being the vehicle fuel consumption of the vehicles that drive on those pavements. So those are the operational emissions. Okay, so when we talk about EPDs, what they are is they're labels. Let's just start with that. It's considered a label, an eco label, that quantifies environmental information about the life cycle of a product or even a service, and it's designed to enable comparisons between products that fulfill the same function. It's often referred to as this nutrition label, like an environmental nutrition label for a product, defined under ISO, the 14025 standard. And this is kind of the easy way of thinking about what is an EPD. EPDs are independently verified, and that's an important kind of component of it. The overall process for developing EPDs, the standards that they're based on, the international standards, as well as the product category rules, are very clearly transparent and identified, and then the process itself is verified. Now, another important footnote here when we talk about materials that fulfill the same function, one of the key caveats to that is the materials have to fall under the same set of product category rules, and that is a really important area in terms of pavements, because there's a different PCR for asphalt mixtures and ready mix concrete and interlocking concrete pavers. All these different paving materials have different PCRs, so they fall that you really shouldn't be comparing them to each other in most cases. So there's a few different types of EPDs, and it's, again, pretty high level here, just making sure we all on the same page. You have an industry-wide EPD here as an example, vinyl siding that you see on a residential home. You buy vinyl siding from Lowe's or Home Depot or whatever materials outlet. If it's produced by a member of the Vinyl Siding Institute, this EPD covers that material. It's a very generic, kind of broad-based perspective. The next example is going to be a product-specific EPD, and this one is a paint made by Hempel. And this is a particular product that's made at a couple of factories around the world. And so this EPD is an average of those two factories, but it does apply to this specific product by the specific manufacturer. And then the third type is a product-specific and plant-specific EPD. And this example is one of my favorites because, boy, I wish I had a private jet that I could say, I've got an EPD for my jet, but this is an EPD for a specific product, a specific model of jet manufactured at a specific facility. And when we talk about EPDs for asphalt mixtures, these are going to be both plant-specific and product-specific EPDs. Similar to, but not quite as exotic as the private jet. So EPDs have what's the scope is an important part of the EPD. What is the scope? It's not just the plant operations. That's fairly easy to calculate. But it's a full kind of life cycle inventory over the scope of cradle to gate. So that means upstream processing of raw materials, transportation of those materials to your plant, and then plant operations themselves. And when we talk about upstream processing, this from the cradle, for aggregates kind of perspective, this is simple in terms of like crushing and screening rock, it blasting it out of the ground and all that sort of thing. And then, the manufacturing process. On asphalt binder, the supply chain is more complex. You've got petroleum extraction out of the ground. You've got transporting that petroleum to refineries, refinery operations, transporting finished binder to the terminal operations. So all this stuff is included in that upstream A1 portion. And hold on just a sec. My 3-year-old wants to say something. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so the other life cycle stages beyond that are not included in the EPD, mostly for a couple of reasons. One is ISO doesn't require you to go beyond cradle to gate, so that's kind of the basic. And the reason for that is the manufacturer or mix producer doesn't really have a lot of control in most cases over these subsequent life cycle stages. You end up having to use scenarios and you model kind of what happens beyond the gate of the plant, and it ends up being pretty generic information and not very insightful in the world of pavements. But if you want to do that analysis, what you can do is use your EPD as a data source, plug that into a full life cycle assessment. So the manufacturer is providing those upstream kind of portions, A1 through A3 with their EPD, and then an agency or researcher or whomever can fill in kind of the assumptions for a particular pavement design, rehabilitation technique, or whatever it might be, to fill in those other life cycle stages. So the one that's kind of gaining a lot of attention right now in our space is FHWA's LCA Pave software. It's not software technically, it's an Excel file, but it's designed for agencies and for academics and researchers to be a relatively simple LCA kind of software solution. So that folks can start conducting LCAs on pavement materials and pavement designs and that sort of thing. And importantly, LCA Pave was designed in the very bottom to be able to take EPD data as an input to those full LCAs that folks might use for different analyses. So the other thing I want to mention, kind of the last thing on kind of background about EPDs, is we use it mostly to look at this embodied carbon, or that portion of embodied carbon associated with construction materials themselves. But it's more than just that carbon or global warming potential that's reported in an EPD. There are dozens of different impact indicators and resource use indicators and other pieces of information that are reported in the EPD. Some examples include things like acid rain forming potential and smog forming potential. And as a kid growing up in the 1980s, I remember a lot of concern about the depletion of the ozone layer. And that solution is mostly being solved right now because of global kind of treaties and whatnot. But there are information about that, those types of environmental impacts, and also a lot of information about resource consumption, energy consumption, recycled materials use, non-renewable energy and renewable energy use, lots of information about those sorts of things, even use of fresh water, for example. So EPDs have a lot of information. It's not just a carbon footprint. That gives you an opportunity to look at trade-offs. Sometimes you may reduce one impact, but have an increase in another impact. And sometimes you have solutions that reduce everything. So it's really beneficial to be able to see those trade-offs. So now I'm going to get into what I would say is the exciting part of this presentation, which is what's going on with policies and programs out there by owners and other agencies and that sort of thing. And I always like to start this with the LEED program, because U.S. Green Building Council's LEED program was the first kind of player in this space. And when they developed the LEED version 4 standard, which went live around 2018, but they were developing it in around 2013 or 14, they said, we're going to start requiring EPDs as a credit requirement. So, so there's a point you can get for a LEED project as a building owner or project team if you collect 20 different EPDs from 20 different products for your building. And this is a LEED project. It's a school with a very large, beautiful asphalt parking lot, I would say. I don't think this asphalt mix producer developed an EPD, because at the time that this was certified, there were very few published EPDs. But this is an example where the mix producer could very easily develop an EPD, provide that to their customer, and provide value to their customer because it helps them earn that point that they're looking to earn. This market is growing. It's kind of steady, but growing, I would say. Last year, 2021, there were almost 500 projects certified and almost 1,400 new projects were registered. So that kind of shows you the trajectory there. We have a good LEED guidance document. It's on our website. I think you folks will get a PDF of this slide deck. That link should be active if you want to click into it. The next stage is at the state and local level, primarily with Buy Clean policies. And California was the first to market with this. Back in 2017, they passed the Buy Clean California Act. That act did not apply to asphalt or concrete, applied to some other construction materials. But Caltrans pretty quickly developed a pilot program because they kind of saw the writing on the wall, and they thought, we need to develop some expertise in this space and get out ahead of the legislature on this. So under, for example, the Buy Clean California Act, for each type of product and subcategory, they establish a maximum global warming potential or GWP limit for that product. And then to qualify for, as a contractor, your material has to fall under that GWP limit. It's what I would say a very draconian pre-qualification requirement. I think it's going to be very difficult to implement kind of at the project level if that specific policy gets handed down to asphalt and concrete. And we're expecting a revision to the Buy Clean California Act probably next legislative session, which is anticipated to include asphalt and concrete, but that's something that we're keeping an eye on. And then last year we had a lot more going on with Colorado and this year Oregon, both passing EPD bills. They're a little different structure, especially the Oregon one is a lot more open as far as what the policies are going to look like, but they all involve collecting EPDs as a starting point, establishing baselines, and then developing policies to reduce emissions using EPDs. And the third one here would be the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. That's a local agency. It's not a very small agency, though. They probably have a larger paving budget than quite a few states. But they have a new program that rolled out this year. If you're doing an asphalt paving job for them, you have to submit an EPD, and they're on a trajectory to kind of ramping up that program over time. A number of other states have looked at policies at the legislative level, but have not passed them. So that's something that to kind of keep an eye on as well. And then we have the federal government, and that's what I'm going to focus on in this next slide here, next couple of slides. There was a executive order last fall that Biden put out that basically established a process for the federal government to look at implementing Buy Clean policies at the agency level. So the first one to do this was the GSA, General Services Administration. They manage federal office buildings, federal courthouses, and land ports of entry. So think of like post offices and social security offices and that sort of thing. They're all part of GSA's purview. So if you're doing a project for the GSA, the requirement, they call it their environmentally preferable asphalt standard. And the first requirement is you have to submit an EPD for each mix that you're going to use on that project. And then the second requirement is you have to use 2 environmentally preferable techniques. And there's a menu of techniques that they kind of allow. And some of these examples include, using more than 20% RAP in your mix, or using ore mix technology to reduce your mix temperature. Other recycled materials like shingles, brown tire rubber, plastic, that sort of thing. Processes at your asphalt plant that can, or even with paving equipment, that improve your energy efficiency or your carbon efficiency or carbon impact. And as an example, they cite natural gas at the asphalt plant as being a low carbon process. And then the last one is pretty open. It says other environmentally preferable techniques. So you can say we're doing something that's different and unique and make a case and they'll consider it. It's I think a fairly good standard. It pretty well reflects where we are as an industry as far as being able to provide EPDs. It's not that hard to do. So you can do that for GSA. It's really kind of developing kind of best practices at that agency level. The other thing going on within the federal government associated with Buy Clean policies is with that executive order that I mentioned earlier, the federal or the White House Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, established a Buy Clean task force. They've been meeting for almost a year now. And what that group is doing is they're coordinating kind of policy recommendations across federal agency. So GSA is involved, and I'm certain, I've talked to GSA folks about this, they've certainly shared what their policy is with the task force and the other participants. Federal Highways is involved, and they've been, from what I understand, fairly influential, which is, I think, a good thing. And then other agencies like EPA, Department of Defense, national parks, federal lands, all that sort of thing. We're expecting, I would say soon, some sort of policy recommendations out of this task force, but we don't have any kind of clarity on when that will be, and we have no idea what is going to be included in those policy recommendations, but it's what we're kind of keeping a really close eye on. So then you have the bipartisan infrastructure law, and there's a number of programs, if you've kind of been paying attention to this space, Another number of new grant programs funded under that legislation. So these are, grants that state and local agencies can apply for transportation infrastructure. And most of these, when you look at the notice of funding opportunities that went out, they said they're looking to fund projects that incorporate lower carbon pavement and construction materials, and projects that use recycled materials or materials that reduce or reverse carbon emissions and that sort of thing. And this has even kind of gone into the Federal Aviation Administration and their airport project funding, incorporating sustainable pavement construction materials as allowable. And that's a challenge, I think, sometimes with the FAA spec, but it's something that you're seeing kind of broadly across these kind of grant programs. And as we get more clarity on kind of federal policy of what that looks like, I think we'll see more and more interest in this sort of low carbon materials as being qualifiers for these types of grant programs. Another new program within the bipartisan infrastructure law is called the Carbon Reduction Program. And this one, it's a $6.4 billion pool of money. And you read the legislation, it's really geared towards reducing vehicle fuel consumption, reducing emissions from transportation, use of transportation assets. And so when we were concerned about this at NAPA, and so we tried to get an amendment passed that would have allowed paving activities to become eligible under this pool of funding. That amendment didn't pass, mostly because they just didn't pass any amendments. It was we had support on both sides of the aisle for it, and DOT supported it. It just didn't pass for political reasons. But DOT was supportive of this kind of approach. And when they issued their guidance on this particular program back in July, they basically adopted our language. And they said, if you're doing, if you're able to conduct an LCA, demonstrate that you're going to have life cycle reductions in carbon emissions, then projects that reduce embodied carbon can qualify under this program. So it's a really interesting interpretation that we're really kind of excited about, because it opens up this pool of funding to the industry for agencies to get funding for these kind of sustainable paving projects and that sort of thing. It'll be interesting to see how that kind of develops over time, with how to quantify emissions and how to demonstrate that to meet the requirements here. But another thing that we're looking at is another project that's we have just gotten under contract with, to develop a framework for agencies to quantify the emissions reductions associated with pavement smoothness. By making smoother pavements, you can reduce vehicle fuel consumption and emissions, and both at initial construction and by optimizing your pavement maintenance kind of practices. So that's something that we're real excited about, and probably next year that should be coming out, and another tool for DOTs to look at to qualify for grants under this program. Then you have the Federal Highways Administration Climate Challenge, which a lot of you folks are probably familiar with, I'm assuming. What we know now is that 25 DOTs submitted applications for a total of 40 projects. So over the next few weeks or months, we'll see kind of what those projects look like. And then another thing funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law was continued funding of the AIDPT program, which helps direct Federal Highways Agency resources on research, including things like vehicle fuel efficiency as affected by pavements, and then upstream energy efficiency of producing paving materials and that sort of thing. Now, the newest and kind of latest of what's going on at the federal level is the Inflation Reduction Act. I always want to call it the Infrastructure Reduction Act, and that's really the opposite of what I want to say is inflation reduction. So under that program, it's a pretty groundbreaking bill in this space of clean materials or buy clean policies, because it provides, first of all, EPA with $250 million, which they're going to use to standardize EPDs and to help industry develop EPDs. So this is going to be through grant programs to industry. And then there's another $100 million to EPA, and they're going to develop a low carbon material labeling program. So think of how like appliances are labeled by Energy Star for energy efficiency. This is going to be for low embodied carbon construction materials, similar to that. So I'm really interested to see how this plays out. Something NAPA is going to be hopefully actively engaged with, how this is going to apply to our industry. So then you have this labeling program, then they're giving GSA over $2 billion to pay for the differential cost or for incentives for low carbon materials or products as labeled by this EPA program. And then another $975 million for emerging sustainable technologies. And that one's a little more nebulous. We're not really sure exactly how it's going to play out, but that's something we're keeping an eye on too. When it comes to agencies for roadways, there's another $2 billion in this act for federal aid highways, federal lands, I think, and other kind of federal assets for, again, just like the GSA, procuring these low carbon construction materials. So the differential cost or incentives at the project level for these low carbon materials. And then the last thing on here is almost $6 billion to the Department of Energy. And this will be grants to industry to help accelerate greenhouse gas emission reductions at industrial facilities. They specifically call out a few industries like cement and steel and a few others. And then presumably like an asphalt plant would fall under the provision of other carbon intensive industries. So we're looking to be able to get that funding open for this industry as well. So that's all kind of what's going on. There's a lot going on, and there's even more that I'm not talking about because it's still kind of in the planning stage and we don't really know what it's going to look like. So let's talk a little bit then about, I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay, I think I'm good. What does it mean for someone to actually develop an EPD as a mixed producer? And I'm going to get cut straight to the chase on this. What we've done at NAPA, we have a full kind of program, and there's a lot more embedded in this with development of product category rules, identifying a program operator, developing underlying LCA. That all, I'm just skipping over all that stuff. I could spend 20 minutes talking about it, but right now that's all you get. But what we've done after doing all those things, we put together this Emerald Ecolabel software. This is a software tool for asphalt mix producers that allows them to very easily and very cost effectively develop verified EPDs. So the EPDs are going to be plant specific and mix specific. So this is for this particular mix design coming out of this particular plant. Can use it for pretty much any asphalt plant in the US. We have a limitation right now with portables, but we're going to be working on getting that functionality put up in the near future. And then the software itself is independently verified, and we have the ability to audit the data that's in there. So there's a lot of veracity as far as what's going on and what the outputs of the software look like. So what kind of data requirements are we looking at? So if you're an asphalt plant, you're going to collect 12 months of data, anytime, any 12 consecutive months within the past 5 years. And you're going to collect things like how much fuel consumption did you have for your burner and your hot oil heater, and if you have generators or other equipment like loaders and skid steers and trucks and that sort of thing, your on-site plant equipment. Electricity consumption, so we kind of use your zip code to tie to the balancing authority for your grid location. How much water consumption for things like dust control or other activities. And then of course you need a denominator on here, and that's going to be how much mix did you sell, right? And that's the normalizing kind of point, because everything is going to be reported in impact per ton of mix produced. So when it comes to the mix design, you input all of your suppliers and your materials, and you're going to input things like, well, what's your mix design to start with? How much aggregate, how much binder, how much recycled material, And do you have any additives? This could be your polymers, this could be your war mix additives and liquid anti-strips and fibers and all that sort of thing. And then importantly, where are those coming from? How far away from the plant are they? And what's the transportation mode? We have locations that bring in aggregates and binder as well by train or by barge or by ocean vessel. So we have data sets for each of those. We also collect the mixed production temperature. We don't actually allocate energy at the plant based on the mixed production temperature, so it's just going to be one number kind of across the board. But we do transparently, in the name of transparency, report what that mixed production temperature is, so the customer can see that. Now, when we talk about all this data, the important thing here is that there's a lot of upstream kind of underlying data in here for things like asphalt binder and for aggregates and for energy, right? These are very kind of common materials. Everything that we're using is being pulled from the federal LCA Commons, which is like a central repository of public data sets. But we're missing data for a lot of additives. We have some data for like SBS polymer, for example, but some of the binder additives and mix additives, you're going to find data gaps for these sorts of things. If you have a data gap material that's more than 1% of the mix by weight, you can't develop an EPD, and the example of this would be slag aggregates. I know the slag industry is working to fill that data gap. That's probably the biggest kind of example. Or if you're doing cutbacks, we don't really have a data set for the cutback asphalt kind of side for a cold mix, for example. But if you have a data gap, the way this shows up is on the cover page of your EPD. You see that red box there, that data completeness statement is indicating that, hey, there's something in this mix that has a data gap. And that's actually specifically indicated on the next page. There's a table of materials, and it's got a little asterisk saying, hey, this is not being accounted for in the EPD. So we're being transparent about that. Right now, the current state of the industry, as far as EPDs, this is as of yesterday, I think I made this slide, 15 states with published EPDs, about 30 asphalt plants, and about 200 different mix designs. And you can see, looking at this list, it's a very broad mix of politically red states and blue states where mixed producers are doing this sort of thing. Quite a few in Colorado, for example, where they have a new bill, but Oregon only has a few. So we're seeing interest kind of broadly. We're seeing interest grow pretty rapidly by the industry. And this is in the first 5 months of this version 2 of the software that we launched in April. We have exceeded the previous 5 years of published EPDs, actually more than doubled the number of published EPDs from the previous 5 years. So I'm going to stop here and turn things over to Richard, and he's going to talk about kind of what the future looks like. And Richard, do you want me to keep going with these slides, or do you want to take over?
I'm not going to say next slide, but I think you can kind of figure out when things are moving. One thing I will say about the last slide, just briefly, is while this shows you, I think the thing to focus on is that's published EPDs. There is an option for plants to create EPDs, but then not publish them. So there are more than just 31 plants across the country that are actively using the software, but some of them are figuring things out and learning a little bit about the program before they actively go out and start publishing EPDs. And so just because you may not see your state up here doesn't mean that it's not being used. And so, like I kind of mentioned earlier, the state of this is changing rapidly. And one of the jokes Joseph and I commonly make is when we're doing presentations on this, we really can't send presentations too far ahead in advance, just because you never know when a piece of legislation or a policy statement is going to come out and drop, which could impact the way we have to look at the way we do our work and the way we talk about this. And this is going to be a constantly evolving process. One of the things that we're doing right now is looking at data quality and data gaps that are out there, and trying to encourage people to help us create a more full picture of the program and what the environmental impacts are related to asphalt. And so when we look at our program, we admit there are current data gaps with certain additives and things like slag, and we need those data gaps to be filled. This is especially important in areas that are setting legislative thresholds and ceilings on what your global warming potential could be. We want to make sure that when those policies are set, we can have that ability to raise those or present a more complete picture of what the asphalt mixture does. We also understand that right now, there are some generalities that are being used. When you look at some of our supply chain, whether it's aggregates or asphalt binder, we're using some very generalized data at the current time. When you look at asphalt binder, for example, there are 4 different asphalt binders that are basically in the AI data set that we can use. A neat or something with virgin or with rubber. There's an SBR that is substituting for SBS. And there's really one number for the whole country. And over time, we're hoping that more and more localized data are used and become available that allow people to look at their specific region or even specific locality beyond just region to get more precise and more realistic numbers that are out there. The other thing to realize is that this is a relatively new area for pavements. I remember it was around 2010 when people started thinking about doing things like life cycle assessment for pavements and for asphalt and for concrete. But in that last 12 years where we've been actively researching and doing things in this space, some of our data sets haven't changed. We're using similar numbers for transportation, energy efficiencies that we were using 20 plus years ago. And this is something that really, as an asphalt mix producer, I can't control. The data are what they are, and we have to use what's available. And so hopefully some of the common inventories that don't just impact our industry, but impact other industries as well, will continue to evolve and continue to get better to give us a more refined state of understanding for where our mixtures really are. The thing that is really kind of on the cutting edge right now is this is an area that is on the forefront of policy. When we think about what's going on a federal level, specifically, and sometimes even on state or local levels, the policy considerations are getting more and more blended with technical considerations. And so when we look at policy that's being created, there are things that you need to understand in terms of the limitations of what an EPD could do, or even some of the dangers or challenges that might present themselves when you're moving forward in this. And that one, when you're thinking about policy, each agency spec is really a different product. And I think about it this way is you choose mixtures and you choose different designs for specific reasons. There's probably a reason that you specify a certain nominal maximum aggregate size aggregate or a certain binder type on relative to an asphalt mixture. And that creates differences in your EPDs and potentially even expected performance. And so for each spec that you have, that is really a different product, and you should not make comparisons between different products. They need to stay within that, even within the same product category rule. There's a lot of places that are looking at setting global warming potential limits or benchmarks or thresholds, or you commonly hear the words like low carbon being tossed around. And there are some inherent dangers in trying to look at things like that. Like, for example, in Colorado, there's almost a pre-qualification type method that is being used for setting a limit for what a global warming potential can be. And we need to understand the things like the regional variations in these types of materials. When talking to a contractor who works across the country, they're even saying, well, within a certain state and a relatively small state, the asphalt binder can range by 0.5% from the east end of the state to the west end of the state, just because of the aggregate that's available, and one's more absorptive than the other. And so we need to understand the variances and how that can impact the global warming potential when setting those limits. Is it better to look at things like incentives, A plus B plus C means, well, how do I look at this and bring LCA and EPDs into the discussion with life cycle cost analysis? And NAPA is hoping in the near future, or actually within the next couple of weeks, to actually do some research and fund some research in this space to understand what are the different kind of contracting mechanisms that are being used to help understand what some of the challenges may be moving forward. But there are definite regional variations. I remember when I was working at NCAT and Randy came and talked to me about taking on some of our sustainability initiatives at that point. I went to the university, and one of the first things that was drilled into my head when we were studying sustainability with other people was that it stems from a sense of place. And what's sustainable in one place may not necessarily be sustainable in another place because of things like material availability, how you have to transport things, your aggregate supply, what fuels are available, or even the grid that you're pulling from that you have absolutely no control over. And so understanding how all of these impact you are going to dictate or really help you in terms of setting policy and understanding what some of these numbers may be. And so the reality is we need to understand the impact of choices that they make and the impact of getting better data, because it may cause our global warming potential to go up. It could cause it to go down. But what it does do is it helps us get a more full picture of what the true environmental impact of our asphalt mixtures are. And as we make these changes and as we look forward to changes in policy, we see that there are going to be different improvements that we need to make as NAPA, as a program operator for our product category rule and our Emerald Ecolabel software. For example, one of the things right now is we can't really allocate energy based on temperature, and that's just because the models aren't robust enough right now to put through the rigorous methods that needed for an EPD or a product category rule. But we're hoping in the near future to understand, well, how do we put things like warm mix asphalt and understand that the temperature reduction and the environmental impacts that may give or lessen impact our EPDs? Or what if I need to increase the temperature of my mixture for a polymer modified mixture, if that's the case? So we need to better understand that allocation process. Right now, there's not a lot of good guidance on things like biogenic carbon. And when we look at things like biofuels or bio-based materials, we understand that these are materials that over their life and while they're rooted into the ground, they take carbon out of the air. And then they replace some of the petroleum-based products that we have out there. But how do we actually account that? And how do we understand the mathematical equations needed for that? And moving into the future, thinking about upstream carbon sequestration. How do we account for things like that? And so it is going to get more complex. It is going to, as it gets more complex, though, it's going to give us a more full picture of the environmental impact. We think sometimes things like life cycle cost analysis is complex. When we look at environmental product declarations in LCA, it becomes even more and more complex because while one thing may actually reduce your global warming potential, it may increase environmental impacts in other categories as well. And you have to understand what's your goal and what are the targets you're looking for. I think that this area is ripe for research and specifically education. LCA for pavements is I call it a relatively new science. It hasn't been around 2 decades where people have been doing a lot of hard and fast research on it. So we need to grow intellectual capacity and expertise. And this includes in academia, in DOTs, and for industry as well. We need to look at things like software development and bringing more and more transparency into these systems. The great thing about our product category rule is you can actually go to it and understand every single assumption that is made through the course of calculating the environmental impact of an EPD. And that's not necessarily true for everything that's out there. We also understand that right now the EPDs don't account for the use phase, which if you have a high volume road currently, that may be a major driver in terms of emissions through things like pavement vehicle interaction. However, we also know that's complex and things like traffic and understanding fuel efficiency of vehicles and how that's going to work over the next 50 years is a very, very challenging thing to predict. And so looking at those models and tying them to reality and then understanding what kind of prediction mechanisms we can have is an important area for us to research and do education on. And if you want more education on that, NAPA will be doing a webinar on that this fall. But also maintenance and rehabilitation schedules. Just like life cycle cost analysis, understanding realistic pavement maintenance schedules is important. It's just as important when it comes to LCA and helping us make good decisions and use realistic data. And finally, common inventories for construction and maintenance practices. We need to be pulling from the same data sets. Otherwise, it's going to create confusion and it can create discrepancies. One of the things related to the asphalt program is if it is a piece of data that is used in an Emerald Eco label or in the NAPA PCR, it is defined so that EPDs are comparable within same products with expected performance, so that you're not looking at data discrepancies and causing a sense of variability within the data. So there's a lot of, go ahead.
Richard, I'm just going to say we have another set of slides, but I think at this point, with where we are in time, the next set is common questions. But I think we just go to kind of wrap up and then go to speaker question or questions from the group.
Yeah, absolutely. We can do that, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. I think just a couple of key takeaways, and then we can go to, let's go to the key takeaway slide, and then we'll hit the questions from the group. And I think because these key takeaways are things that are important for you to remember moving forward, is EPDs do provide verified data to quantify environmental impacts. When a PCR is developed, it goes through a rigorous process to ensure that it is really the state, as much of the state of the science as it can be at that time. And that includes external review, and we try to make this as transparent as possible. Everyone and their mother could have commented on our PCR, and we show people those comments and how we handle them. The other thing is buy clean policies and EPD policies are spreading quickly. And while you may not think your legislature is going to be the one handing it down for you, it is soon probably going to be attached to federal dollars. And that may be through a federal lands program, National Park Services, or GSA, or even your state highway funding potentially in the future as an opportunity to get some additional funding. And the IRA is going to accelerate the demand for low carbon materials, and it's important to have those conversations. So there are some things that we can do right now to reduce emissions. There are existing practices, technologies which are available. Sometimes it's going to require specification changes to do that. Sometimes it's going to take contractors looking at their operations. But emission reductions are possible. And if you look at the recent greenhouse gas inventory that we published, you can get that for free on the NAPA SOAR website. It shows you some of those opportunities. But we'd really love to spend the next 20, 25 minutes answering your questions and maybe trying to help dispel a few of the myths that may be out there related to EPDs or questions that you may have. And even after this webinar, we are a resource for you to help you understand what's coming and how it could be used as a contractor, or talk with you if you're looking at developing policies in your states about some of the things that are out there.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I just want to say thank you for the group here, and I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of questions you guys have. Let's take a look at the chat. Randy asked, you mentioned the EPDs are independently verified. Who does that verification? So let me just take a minute to explain how that works. We have the software itself, which is independently verified by a third party, and that's a LCA consultant who does that verification. And what they do is they verify that the software meets all the requirements of the PCR. But then within the software, and this is all transparent as far as what our procedures are, we have embedded into their algorithms to ensure the validity of some of the key data points that are entered by mix producers. And so when they did that verification, that was part of that. So it's sort of like when you do TurboTax and it says check my taxes before you submit it, it's sort of like that, where there's an algorithm that's running to make sure that the data is actually reasonable and within certain statistical ranges. And then on top of that, we have the ability to audit the data if we see something that looks weird, or through a random audit process. And that's kind of going back to the income tax model, the same way the IRS has a threat of an audit. We have a threat of an audit to help ensure compliance kind of across the users. So to answer the question, the verification is done at the software level by a third-party consultant who specializes in EPDs and LCAs. And then for the actual EPDs that are produced, it's kind of through that process of the software and the auditing process. Yeah, that's a good question, Randy. So thank you. And I'm going to assume that there are other questions here. Bring it back to the group. Otherwise, this will be the easiest crowd that I've had in a long time.
Hey, Joseph, do y'all see the questions on chat?
Okay, got a new one.
Yeah.
How do you determine the GWP of recycled materials as a mixed component? That's a good one. So when you're looking at recycled materials, within the framework of an EPD or an LCA, you have what's called the cutoff rule. So that means all the upstream impacts associated with the previous life of that material come into the system free of charge. Like they come in burden free, they call it. So for RAP, for example, we start that with wherever the initial storage or processing location is, that's where we start the system for RAP. So it gets milled off a job site and it gets delivered to some initial storage or processing location, which is usually but not always the plant. All that stuff happens upstream and we don't account for it in the EPD directly. But then we do have kind of predetermined variables for RAP processing. That's a really minor impact. It's like, 1/10 of a gallon of diesel per ton of RAP processed. It has almost zero impact on the actual EPD results. But because of that recycled material really reduces your burdens, because now you're offsetting your aggregates, the transportation of aggregates when those places are from long distances away, and also your asphalt binder. So you're getting basically a low carbon material is replacing a higher carbon kind of materials within your mixed design.
Thank you. There's a question from Aaron Belt that was before mine. So if you're looking at the chat, you need to scroll back up a little bit.
Oh yeah, good.
Yeah. Would repaving projects that demonstrate carbon reduction qualify for carbon reduction program monies through FHWA? Joseph, feel free to add on to this. It is my understanding that yes, they do. Now there's still a little bit of ambiguity in like how you have to show that they're low carbon. But they did come out with some guidance recently that said that paving activities would be incorporated in this program. And so that's something that I think is a good conversation with FHWA, and it is an opportunity. I mean, that's a pretty big pot of money that's open. And so I know in the past we had talked about either through materials or potentially showing through smoother pavements, how you're reducing fuel economy, or you're increasing fuel economy and reducing emissions that way. I think you can probably get creative in how you try to approach that, but it is an option.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that, if you look at the FHWA Climate Challenge, one of the goals for that program was to develop expertise or kind of knowledge within agencies of how to quantify emissions reductions associated with things like low carbon materials. So the Climate Challenge really dovetails nicely into how do you demonstrate and quantify those emissions reductions that you could then put into a grant application. Yeah.
So the next question is, do EPDs have an expiration date, or do they require re-verification every so often? And that's a great question. because our program is set up a little bit different than some of the other programs that are out there. The NAPA PCR basically says some programs will say your EPD is good for 5 years. And so you could, anytime in the period where that PCR is valid, you could create an EPD and it'd be good for the next 5 years. Our program is not like that. Our program has an EPD that is only valid as long as the PCR is valid. And so if I think our PCR expires April 1st or May 30th or 31st, depending on how many days March has, in 5 years. And so when the PCR expires, you have to start making new EPDs based on the new PCR. The reason that we do that is so that there are not EPDs out there using different sets of rules and different sets of standards at the same time that are valid. And so that is, again, something that we've done programmatically to try to ensure that there is less confusion, there's less discrepancies between EPDs that are valid out at the same time. And so when the PCR expires and version 3 of the PCR comes out, people will have to go back in and make new EPDs. We're going to try to make that process as easy and painless as possible, and only ask for new information where needed. But you will need to do things like probably update your energy information at your plant, like how much fuel did you use, because that has to be, again, it's only valid for a certain amount of time. And you have to produce 12 months of consistent data. And so, yes, there will come a time when you have to redo it, but we've tried to align that as much with the PCR change as possible.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is your plant data, you only have to update every 5 years, but with our software, if you want to update it every year, you can go ahead and do that. And if you are installing more energy efficient equipment, or you change fuels, and some things will trigger, like if you're changing fuels, you should be developing a new resetting your data and developing a new EPD anyway, because it's a significant change to your operations. Okay. Any other questions out there? I'm hearing the silence of the Zoom. So
it's the crickets.
Well, again, I will offer, if our contact information is on the slides, and Randy will send you the slide deck where if you want to send it out to the Capri membership, you can. But please don't hesitate to reach out to Joseph or myself if you have questions. We are in the process of doing additional research, and right now we're looking at developing guidance for additive manufacturers on how to incorporate their additives into our program. And so stay tuned. It's going to get more transparent, more, like I said, a better picture of the reality, and it's going to be important. It's going to be an opportunity for agencies and contractors to get more money for their states to extend and do more paving and do more highway work. And so use that as an opportunity to grow what you're doing.
Richard and Joseph, thank you so much for taking the time to put this information together for the Capri members. I always learn something by watching, you guys talk. So thanks so much for, giving us a pretty good fundamental understanding of, where we are with this new kind of information, new world that we're working on, and what it means to the future. So we did record the session, and I hope that's okay. We would only share that with Capri members, but I think I'll have Stacy, once we get the Zoom, Zoom video downloaded, we'll have her send that out to everybody so that if you do have some questions, as well as the slide deck that Richard and Joseph had. So thanks again, everybody. And with that, I guess we'll say we're done.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.